Welcome to another in our series, SOS, Support Our Schools. The series is presented by the DYSOS Committee, a group of Yarmouth residents who have met out of their concern for supporting public education. We want to acknowledge some people associated with this program. Dick McGarr, Chairman of our SOS Committee, Richard Sentner, a member of the committee who produces this show, and starting with this program, one of our other members, George Higginbottom, is going to be taking notes on the show for use in our DYSOS blog. We're also, as always, very grateful to the crew from Channel 17 that does this for us very well, very successfully, and very professionally each time we meet. We're focusing today on what we've called realities. There's so much discussion about budgets and budget allocations and use of money and funding from various sources. It seemed to us important that we should clarify how all of this goes down. And in order to do that, we are very pleased to have as our three guests, Carol Woodbury, Superintendent of Schools for the DY District, and Judy Dion, who is Director of Pupil Services for the district, and Gloria Lemerise, who is Director of Instruction. And we know that at the conclusion of this, you will have a great deal more information. I would also remind you that this series is rebroadcast on Channel 22, the DY Schools channel, and it appears, each show appears for 2 successive weeks on Channel 17, Mondays at 4 p.m. and Thursdays at 7 p.m. Carol, a lot of ground to cover. We could start almost anywhere, but we might want to start, if you don't mind, with the relationship between districts, particularly our district, and state. There's been so much misinformation, lack of understanding. What does the state provide? What does the state require? How does the district respond to the various mandates and so forth?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to start all the way back in 1993 when education reform in the state was first passed. Prior to, and a lot of people don't know this, so prior to 1993, the state had no requirements for spending on education by the cities and towns. There were no requirements whatsoever for how much a city or town had to spend on their educational programs. So one of the things that we saw, obviously it came out of a court case, was that there was unequal spending across the state. Some districts had a lot of money because the towns and cities valued a high quality education and funded them at a very good rate, and in other places they were just getting by. So the state's idea in 1993 was to equalize the playing field. The big statement at the time was that the quality of your education should not be as a result of your zip code. And so thus came the Chapter 70 formula that we fondly refer to it as, but it is the statutory formula for figuring out school district spending. So what happens initially is the state has a formula. It's a very complicated formula, but it is based on your student enrollment. Kids count for various categories. For example, if you have special needs children, they might count at a different rate, or if you have students whose first language is not English, they might count at a different rate. Costs more to educate children in a high school than it does in an elementary school. So there are all these different variables, and the state takes your enrollment and figures out what it is that would be an adequate budget for their school districts. And that's actually something that's kind of interesting too, is because there's a lot of discussion right now on whether or not adequate is truly adequate, the definition of that word. So they figure out what cities and towns are required to pay, and there's a minimum required contribution. And then on top of that, cities and towns can pay more if they so choose than the minimum required. So that's kind of how it all starts. I mean, I'm trying to boil down something that's quite complicated into something very, very simple. Once they figure out which each city and town is required to pay, it's based on the income of the community. It's also based on the property values of the community. It's based on their municipal revenue growth factors and on inflation. The state, the whole idea was to fill in the gap between what was adequate and what the town could afford to pay with state aid. And so that's where it kind of all begins, really. Above that, you know, if you want to get into talking about a regional district in each community, the minimum required is established individually. And then the state adds those two minimum requireds together, throws in their state aid, and that's our minimum required spending.
I'd like to, before the hour's over, get back to that regional question.
Okay.
But following up, Judy, with a point that Carol made in terms of special kinds of allocations. Now, this is sort of your area, isn't it?
Yes.
And what, not the exact numbers, but there clearly are different numbers for some special cases. What are some of the special cases?
Some of the issues are we're all driven by federal mandates, all of the programs that we do for special education. So what we have to do is from the time a child turns 3 years old, if they have a defined disability and require special education, then we really have to make sure that we have all of the programs and services in place for them. So that really takes a significant impact. So when we're looking at a regular local school budget, we have X number of dollars. And if I don't have enough money to provide all of the services that we are required to have, it will take a portion of that local budget to make sure that we're meeting our legal mandates. So that's how the impact in that works.
That's not optional, right?
It is not optional. It's
so
mandated by federal.
If there's an unanticipated number of special needs, then that comes out of the...
That comes out of the general ed. We keep on drawing down, and that it has a significant impact on our budget.
Does the state give additional support for
For special,
students?
well, it does in a reimbursement formula, which they put in place about 5 or 6 years ago, called the circuit breaker. They think that because we have circuit breaker, that all of our special education costs are covered. However, when that regulation was put into place, they had a minimum requirement that we had to spend. And then the state picked up a portion above that, and then the remainder the locals had to pay again. So when they started out, they said, based on appropriations, the state will give you back up to 75% of the cost of your very expensive children. However, last year we were down to a 40% reimbursement, and then they raised the floor of what we had to spend. So we were coming in this way. And again impacting the local dollars that we have for education.
The state had dropped that to 40%?
They dropped it from 72 down to 40% of the reimbursement rate. They raised the floor, so we had to spend more, and they reduced the reimbursement. So we're coming crushed in the middle and impacting.
Yeah, I want to jump in on that because I think people might not understand what the floor is. I think
we're at $38,700. That's the floor.
We have to spend $38,700 on one student before we're eligible for the reimbursement. One student with some special needs.
Okay.
We have to spend the $38,700 before we get 40% of what's left over. So if it was $100,000 that we had to spend on a particular student, 62,000, we'd get 40% of the 62,000. So you see, we're already spending. And I think if you looked at the overall per pupil expenditures across the Cape, you'd see that it's in the neighborhood of around $13,000 per student. So we're talking about a significantly higher amount before any reimbursement kicks in.
In an area where you don't have much discretion. I mean, this
No.
We have
we're in the mandate area here.
mandates.
Right. And I guess I always want to say something a little bit about that too, because I do feel that sometimes it's unfortunate that people kind of get concerned about what special ed costs and so on and so forth. And if you were a parent who had a special needs child, you would want your school district to do everything possible to give your child access to the same curriculum that other people's children have. So I want to make it kind of clear that we're not sending the message that this is like unfair or something.
Or onerous. It's just
Exactly. It's just what exists.
Exactly.
And the story I always like to use as an example is that, John, you wear glasses. The three of us don't wear glasses. Should we all get glasses because you have glasses, John? That's probably, you know, but is it fair for you not to have glasses and have to read the same book that all of us have to read? So, you know, we have to be careful about some children need something special in order to be able to access the curriculum effectively.
because we're a democratic society.
That's correct.
Gloria, the other thing, I'm sorry, you were going to...
No, good.
Another thing that Carol used, a very interesting term, what is adequate? What is
I'm
an
glad I didn't have
adequate curriculum?
Sure you don't want to ask Judy? I think it's, you know, it's a very complicated issue, especially when you have a very diverse student body in your school district, and that's pretty common across the state. But we have a lot of needs for students at all different levels and in all different ways. So determining what is adequate sometimes is more complicated than it looks on the surface. You have to think a lot about who's in my classroom, what kind of professional development does my teacher need in order to best meet the needs of those students. For example, if I have a significant number of students who don't speak English as their first language, I'm going to have to be sure that the teacher is prepared to provide the kind of sheltered instruction that they need. Or if I have a student that's gifted, I need to have a teacher who knows how to ratchet up the curriculum or provide extended learning opportunities for those children as well. I want to mainstream as many children as I can, so I want a wide variety of students in my classroom because we all learn from one another, and we want to be sure that we give opportunity for all students to have access to the adequate curriculum, but also what we locally feel are the things that students need in order to become successful in society at large.
That ratchets up Carol's point, I think, very well, that just as you said the parents of a special needs student ought to have the school provide whatever is necessary, the parents of I tend not to use the word gifted, but very talented, highly motivated student ought to have the same kind of attention. So we stop dealing with numbers. We're talking about actual kids out there who have particular kinds of interests and motivations and needs. The other question I had on, just not to dwell on it a lot, but to go back before we leave the state, I understand there is some reduction in state reimbursements.
That's correct.
Is that coming down, or has it come down?
Well, now that the state budget is settled, we have a 4% cut in what would been the state aid to us. There are some other things that are still slightly unsettled. The regional transportation reimbursement, we don't know for sure. And here's where like different governments impact each other. The federal government was going to extend, I believe it was the Medicaid reimbursement to the states for another 6 months. And so far they have failed to do that. And our budget, the governor's budget, the